everyone, I'm Mike Ward and welcome to Conversations in Healthcare, a video series brought to you by DRG, part of Clarivate. This episode is one of a number that we're recording alongside On Helix, a digital conference that is hosted by One Nucleus. In line with this, I'm delighted to be joined by Houman Ashrafian, who's going to offer us some insights from the perspective of an investor in biotech from early research right the way through to clinical development. Houman is a managing partner at SV Health Sciences, one of the foremost backers of the life science companies in the preeminent biotech clusters, whether that's in the US or here in the UK. He has founded 5 SV companies, Citrix, Anara Bio, Zaradex, T-Rex Bio, and Alchemab. And he's also a director of the SV portfolio company, Caris Therapeutics. Houman also actually serves on the Dementia Discovery Fund investment committee. So Houman, I hope you and those you care about are safe and keeping well. And thanks so much for joining me.
Morning, thanks Mike, and thank you for having me. It's a curious way to communicate in these times, but it's lovely to be here.
Yeah, great. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So an analysis of biotech investment trends that was recently published by the UK Bioindustry Association, based on data, in fact, that was provided by DRG and BioWorld, suggested that fund flows into the sector actually are remaining robust. And I just wonder, is that something, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's a really interesting question. Not only does it resonate, but stacks very nicely with data in the sort of in the macro of what's going on. Although there's been a recent correction over the last couple of weeks, perhaps there's been substantial inflows into biotech funds and actually into the public markets by retail investors who are interested in biotech. It's been a really interesting time. So as you'll intuit, a number of funds, even in spite of COVID or because of COVID, have been able to do very substantial fundraisings. You'll have seen Arch, Flagship, and Atlas. Venbio closed very large funds. We're due to close our own very soon. And importantly, a number of UK and European funds have done very nicely recently. I'd like to call out BBB, who've done a very nice job supporting UK funds. So there's been inflows at fund level. There's retail investor inflows into the public markets, and importantly, and amazingly, quite a lot of deals done during the COVID era. Historically, you'll have seen the Gilead deal with Galapagos. BioNTech raised their monster round, and even in our portfolio, we've seen a number of deals done. I did one on Monday, and my first portfolio company, Citrix, did a deal with Eli Lilly and Co. Over the summer. So I think it's fair to say there's been a very substantial flow of funds and flow of capital into funds, into the public markets, and excitingly, quite a lot of funds flowing into UK and Europe.
So I mean that is interesting. So social distancing and travel restrictions don't seem to have had an impact at that level. However, has it affected your ability to support either existing portfolio companies or maybe initiate due diligence on ones that you're looking to put some money into?
So that's a complicated question. I'll try and break it down into its relative components. I think that calling out what's been hard, obviously hiring is particularly difficult. So the recruitment of talent when you can't do face-to-face meetings has been rather challenging. And people have obviously become much more adept at doing interviews digitally, or taking advantage of our many green spaces, both in the UK, Europe, and the US, to have walking interviews. So I think recruitment has been a bit of a challenge, and I think there's been a slowing down broadly in recruitment, and I think that recruiting firms affirm that view. And the second challenge has been, of course, that we've been very thoughtful about how we construct commitments and reserves to our companies, both in the UK and the US. In the UK, we're very lucky. The government has been extremely thoughtful, and the implementation of all sorts of capability, including non-dilutive funding, the furlough scheme, which we've largely not used, but also the Futures Fund has been extremely helpful in supporting companies that need it. So I would say that the two challenges around recruiting and financing have been managed as we do normally, by constructing runways for our companies with and without government support to ensure they're well protected. And we generally have deep reserves for our companies, so that's not really been a problem. SC is a transatlantic fund, so and we obviously have a very substantial network which is mature. So actually, it's been pretty easy to communicate with Zoom. I'd say there's been almost no disruption in any of our ongoing diligence and communication activities. And one of the advantages, of course, is people aren't traveling, so they're always available. I think we're working harder than we ever have sitting at our desks. So I haven't seen any change in interaction, both internally and externally. And then finally, there was a question about diligence. Well, we closed the deal on Monday. So diligence, the deal was under term sheet around the time of lockdown, so it was an advanced stage of diligence anyway. But I think it's important to say that both from a UK PLC and US perspective, we're open for business.
Right. So we've seen some of the companies in your portfolio have actually diverted some efforts to respond to the COVID-19 challenge. So can you highlight some examples and outline the process that actually took place at sort of the management board level to actually enable that shift in focus to take place?
So we're very active board participants. As you said, I founded a number of these companies, and I'm very close. I chair many of them, and I'm rather close to all the CEOs. So the process is a rather organic one, I would say. All the companies are very thoughtful about staying on mission. COVID is ultra important, but there are other disorders out there, whether they're immunoinflammation, cancer, orphan disorders, or otherwise. So the first thing to say is all the companies, actually, I'm gratified and honored by our entrepreneurs and teams, because they very quickly configured themselves without much nudging required from the board or anyone else, actually, to ensure that their business as usual continued. Shift working in a lab, setting up appropriate social distancing, ensuring that only the people that need to go into the lab, etc. And really very creative ways which our C-suites have implemented to ensure work goes on as usual. So part one of the response to you is through a lot of creativity, and we can double click on some of those, our work continued. And we really didn't lose much ground during the COVID era. The only groups that did lose ground, I think we'll touch on this perhaps a little later, are companies that had clinical assets that were in the midst of clinical trials. The companies, for example, Alchemab in my portfolio, that in the SC portfolio, that had a component of focus on COVID, did it very organically. They approached, the management team laid out a very clear structure on how work would go on as usual, but COVID work would go on alongside it. What the financing would be required internally and externally, how they'd work with governments and other organizations, and how that work would ultimately proceed and lead to value for patients, which is ultimately what we're here to do. And I would say that systematic approach to COVID was one that then would come up to the board, we'd modify it and move forward. And just to call out the core team at Alchemab, for example, Alex Leach, who's the CEO, Jane Osborne, the CSO, and Olivia Cavalan, who's the head of operations and BD, very quickly put a robust plan together, and all we really needed to do is provide some editorial content and move on. The last thing I'd say actually is though that it's not a one-stop shop. You know, we continue to monitor what's going on in the ecosystem. We're very proud of Kate Bingham, one of my partners, who now leads the UK Vaccine Task Force, and we monitor what she and others are doing and what's being produced in the ecosystem and what's happening with in terms of epidemiological trends, and marry that up to what the companies are doing. And that is the job of the board.
Actually, that sort of brings us sort of, nicely to the fact that SV has a proven track record for establishing sort of new companies, new businesses. So can you actually sort of describe how you go about identifying interesting programs, and what needs to be there to whet your appetite in the first place?
Yeah, so it sounds rather simplistic, but it's about people, technology, and financing, right? That's largely what we do. I'll speak for the UK for now, but actually I think it's also true of Europe and the US. There's a remarkable amount of wonderful things going on at the moment. Science is accelerating to a singularity. There's no doubt about it in my mind. Just look at how we dealt with flu in the last century and how we're dealing with a similar pandemic now. If you see the degree of agency that we have as a science community to deal with it, whether it's vaccines, whether it's convalescent serum, whether it's monoclonal antibodies or other technologies, small molecules, science has come on a long way, driven by a number of ways, including the sequencing revolution. So we're privileged to be sitting at a time like no other, where we can impact on human disease in ways that were unimaginable 50 or 100 years ago. So we're very lucky. There's an embrasse de richesse of stuff out there, and our job is to work with partners, for example, in our case, CR UK, the Francis Crick Institute, and the multitude of UK universities who are doing great work. Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, other London universities, but also far beyond. We've done deals with Cardiff and are in the process of doing deals in Scotland and elsewhere. It's important to say there's this huge source of value for patients in the science that's being done. And our job is to go and pick out stuff that looks like it's ready to have the value inflection and be translatable. So how do we do this? At SV Health Investors, we're super connected to academic groups, but also to industrial groups that are doing this work. There's constant dialogue. It's, again, not a one-stop shop. Most of the opportunities arise out of recurrent conversations to see what's translatable and relevant, and that has potential patient value and line of sight to a therapeutic within a reasonable time frame and a financing window. So how do we do this? We identify those opportunities. We talk to investigators before stuff's even published. We help them refine it. Often it's a 2 or 3 year process to refine even before we look at it within our own portfolio, and that academic engagement is critical. And then when it's ready, we work with the other important part of what I described as the entrepreneurs. So typically we bring in experienced entrepreneurs early who can work with those academics and build things. And the recipe is very simple. You have the core founders who bring in the academic knowledge, sometimes with IP, sometimes without. You wrap around them a skilled entrepreneurial team who know what they're doing, and you wrap around them a board who's there to support, guide, finance, and drive to exit. And in that way, we generate what the most important thing we do is patient value.
Okay, so we'll return to that, but in terms of sort of looking at the science and technology, is it that you're starting off with that there is a scientific, a medical, a technical challenge, and you go off to look to sort of see, is there a solution somewhere, or is it somebody comes along and says, actually, we've got this interesting observation, we've made this interesting discovery, and then you sort of think, right, oh, that could be applied in a particular area. So I'm just sort of trying to that scouting mission. What does that look like?
It's a bit of both, really. I mean, it's extremely rare for a founder to come along and say, look, I've got this very shiny jewel, I've shined it up, I've already buffed it up and it's ready to go. It may happen a little bit more in the United States, and we're clearly active in the US, where the academics are a little bit more savvy about commercial activity. I think we're actually catching up very quickly. But it's very rare that a full-time academic comes along and says, look, I've got this thing, it's ready to go, this is the TPP, this is what I'd construct as a business case, these are the value inflections, and this is how I drug it. I mean, it would be wonderful, of course, just doesn't happen. So typically what happens is that myself, Kate, or Mike Ross, the three managing partners, supported by our venture partner pool, will be talking to people, and we'll often have 2 or 3 conversations, and someone will come along with something that's kind of interesting, and we will think, oh, well, actually, that would solve this kind of problem. And we'll have, as I say, we'd have 2 or 3 conversations, maybe bring in some experts, maybe hold what we call the prepared minds exercise, where we bring in academics and commercial people, put them together and have a discourse. And only through that process of dialogue do you refine investable and therapeutic opportunity. So it's a journey rather than a conversation.
Okay, so one of the biggest challenges is translating those sort of interesting discoveries into an innovation that actually can benefit patients. You mentioned earlier about one of the things that you do is you look to find entrepreneurs who have successfully done this before, to help build out your teams. What are the challenges in that sort of translation from the interesting discovery into something that's going to be useful? Are there, and what are the approaches that you take to meet those challenges?
Yeah, so I think that there are all manner of challenges, and we can construct those challenges in different ways. You can perceive them from the perspective of risk. You can go from the sort of target risk, biology risk, drugging risk, development risk, ultimately financing risk and regulatory risk. I think that's one way to look at it. It's kind of sterile, and it doesn't really help you think about the real challenges. I think fundamentally, the challenges now relate, all of those are germane, but the big challenge I see is achieving the key value inflection, which is the first in human study, and indeed the first in patient study. I'm pleased to say that in the UK, we're batting it out the ballpark, something that one of my US colleagues said to me a couple of days ago. We are increasingly looking at that event horizon, which is first in patient. And the reason we're looking at that is because we're blessed with the NHS. We have a collection of patients in whom we can do clinical trials and to provide benefit to those patients by being part of the clinical trial. But by having that capability and an aligned regulator in the MHRA who is amenable to thoughtful, vigilant, but pragmatic introduction of drugs early into patients, We've seen that with COVID and the MHRA's wonderful response to COVID. What it means is that we can scope out where that value inflection is, which is that first in patient study. And I discriminate between first in human and first in patient for obvious reasons. And then the challenge becomes how to get there. So increasingly the dialogue when we see a great piece of technology is not what was a traditional pharma, very old traditional pharma perspective of kind of interesting biology, we can drug it, let's do that and we'll figure out who the patient is. The challenge and the opportunity today, particularly in the UK but beyond, is to say day one, who are we treating and what are we trying to achieve? And the challenge is to build, to shape the path of risk from early science to the patient on day one. And I think that scrutiny and focus is going to pay dividends patient care.
And how do you ensure that you are able to factor in the sort of, I guess, the patient voice into those early discussions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's something that we need to continue improving on. The two aspects to patient voice. One is the patient need and the patient's perspective of their need. And often this sort of, for example, crystallizes out in symptomatic versus disease-modifying treatments. But I'm going to take a different tack. The first thing that is increasingly done by reputable biotech and venture-backed companies is in order to have the patient voice, we increasingly have clinicians early in the process. So historically, as you'll know, there was a sort of modular piece where discovery was done and then development was done and then the clinical aspects were done. That doesn't, at least in our portfolio, happen anymore. We have a more nuanced stakeholder base when we look at opportunities. And it's totally usual for funds like ours to ask, who are you planning to treat and what do they look like? And the answer cannot be heart failure. The answer has to be, this particular substrata of heart failure that's particularly likely to benefit because of the biology. And you'd be surprised how frequently that conversation happens at the same time as we're beginning to think about target validation of a target. And we very early on in our process have a TCP, a target concept profile, and a TPP, target product profile, absolutely at the point where targets make portfolio entry. So the patient voice is heard both vicariously through the clinician, but also actually we've had examples where we brought patients into the company to talk to the scientist and say, what really bothers me about my rheumatoid arthritis or about my angina or about, my colorectal cancer is so and so. I mean, I think we actually hear the patient voice.
Yeah. So SV, as I say, you're very active. Is there a sort of a clinical sweet spot for the business? And also, you mentioned that you've got activity here in the UK and you have activity in the States. Is there sort of a geographic focus as well on what you're doing?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we have a clinical sweet spot. If you look at the partnership in the Impact Medicine Fund, our fund, Kate, Mike Ross, and myself have complementary and overlapping skills actually in different stages of drug development. And so we're very thoughtful about portfolio construction. So as I said to you, my latest investment, which was Monday, the days seem to be merging now, 2 days ago, was a phase 2 ready asset that's about to pull the trigger on 3 phase 2 studies. But we will also, we have companies in the fund that started with a white sheet of paper and haven't yet nominated targets. So we look through this in terms of the lens of what's right for our LPs, what's right for our patients, portfolio construction, etc. but we'll do very early, very late stuff that's in the middle. And our geography is typically 2/3 UK and 1/3 US, but it's kind of fluid, and we don't have any dogmatic view of how we invest.
Right. And yet, I mean, you're on the investment committee for the Dementia Discovery Fund. In fact, it's the other way around. I think it's 2/3 US that's in that portfolio, one-third in the UK. With the Dementia Discovery Fund, what are the areas you're most keen to back? And again, what does an opportunity already have in place to attract your interest?
Yeah, I think dementia is obviously a neurodegeneration more broadly is a massive and important unmet medical need today, and is set to grow with the demographic transition. So, what are we keen to back? The mission of the fund is to identify and develop, areas of science that will be transformative in the treatment of dementia. And we've got an incredible responsibility actually with that fund. There aren't too many theme funds out there, and neurodegeneration is a great one. So we think about the fund in a number of ways. It's obviously a very clear commercial entity, and our aim is to identify transformative therapeutics. And our primary role is to look at disease-modifying therapies, but also symptomatic therapies. And all that goes with those, the ancillary elements to those, tools for stratification, including digital tools. So, although while our primary focus is therapeutics, we will consider anything that wraps around our therapeutics that enables those therapeutics to be transformative. To be very specific, we have multiple vectors at which we look. There are areas that we care about, including glial health and neuroinflammation, synaptic health, membrane biology and lysosomal disease, and mitochondrial health and disease and autophagy. Those are core areas, but we underpin all of those areas with platform technologies, and we are happy to do standalone or work with companies that have existing platform technologies and help them direct those to neurodegeneration. Looking at it alternatively, we'll look at all the relevant diseases in that group, whether it's tauopathies, whether it's Parkinson's disease and synucleinopathies, whether, of course, at the center of all of this is Alzheimer's disease, and many others. So we have a sort of mechanistic perspective, we have a disease lens, and we have a platform perspective, and we'll look at early all the way through to clinical assets. I guess we remain opportunistic, and importantly, our North Star is to identify outstanding transformative modalities in order to treat neurodegeneration.
So you've got 16 companies in the portfolio at the moment. So how many do you anticipate? I mean, are going to be backed by the fund?
Yeah, so great question. So small update, we have 19 companies in the portfolio, in fact, now. Small update over the last couple of months. 3 have been added recently, all 3 in the US, actually, to your first point. We'll continue to invest the fund, but of course our big job is to continue curating those companies, and many of them are doing very well. So we will add more to the number of companies, but we're also doubling down on those that we've already invested.
All right. So you mentioned digital health, and one of the things that in our research at DRG, we've seen a massive uptick in digital health activity, particularly with physicians and their interactions with patients. I'm just wondering whether with COVID-19 that there are areas that may have been not a priority in the past have actually sort of been pushed to the fore in, so whether that's in digital health or in other areas.
Yeah, so I'll answer those in 3 short bullet points. The first is digital health is kind of interesting. Historically, dinosaurs like me have been prone to thinking about things as therapeutics or diagnostics. I think digital is an interesting area that marries those two up increasingly. I think that the natural distinction between those entities is blurring. So I think digital health is quite interesting, and particularly in the dementia space where diagnosis is such a problem. I think digital health is making a big difference. One of our venture partners and a close friend, Ruth McKernan, is launching a digital health company in the neurodegeneration space. Look out for that. I think it'll be very exciting. So yes, we as a manager in terms of SP Health Investors, and each of our funds is looking at digital in a greater way. I think you'll see a resurgence, and it's a necessary resurgence in infectious disease, whether it be in the space of antibiotics, antibiotic resistance, or antivirals. I think that will be something that across our ecosystem there'll be greater attention lavished upon. But it's also true that science marches on. If you open the latest issue of Nature, there's as much about senescence, T-cell therapy directed to senescence, as much about human microenvironment as there is about COVID-19. So I definitely think that I don't want anyone to walk away from this asking the question about whether business as usual is going on. Business as usual is going on. My strong advocation, and I'm pleased to hear our friends at BBB and others have heard it, and indeed government has heard it, that the UK needs to now step up. We have one of the most outstanding science bases in the world. We have great entrepreneurs, and we have a functional and attentive venture community. And what we now need to do is put those things together as the field has been maturing, with adequate growth capital to generate thoughtful progression of those assets. The time has come for the UK to step up and really mature into an organization, a country, UK PLC, where not only can we build those small outstanding biotechs, and I'm proud to have a number of those in my own portfolio, but to be able to curate them into much larger entities that can be the source of intellectual and capital and knowledge-based economy going forward. And I personally think that if you look at how the NBI has outperformed almost any other part of the economy in the US, the public markets, that we, the UK, are poised with the right capital injection to achieve that. So I slightly diverted your question, but the answer to your question, in my view, is if we build those structures, then all the therapeutic areas will benefit from the UK science ecosystem.
So you're not concerned with the fact that there's so much effort, finance going into sort of tackling COVID, not only in sort of the wider economy, but actually also we can sort of see the amount of money that's being invested at the sort of scientific level in COVID. You're not worried that that's going to sort of to the detriment of say, for example, research into dementia?
I think there is a temporary and unprecedented global need, and I think it's natural that there's been a bit of a diversion of time and resource. I think that as we come out of lockdown, and I think the UK has behaved very well, I think personally that we have flattened the peak, and our the second peak is, I hope, will be well controlled. We all trust in Kate and her team in the UK government. I think that diversion will revert, and I don't see this as anything other than a wrinkle, actually. And I applaud all those I'm humbled actually by those that work with us and for us, who've soldiered on through this period in our companies to carry on with business as usual. And they need to be supported by the appropriate financing to take those assets all the way through to clinic and ultimately to licensing.
Okay, so as a final point, and again, looking at what's going on in that sort of neurodegeneration space, we in the past sort of decade or so, we've seen sort of a revolution in the immune-oncology, where sort of scientific breakthroughs have really made a meaningful difference to the clinical and the patient experience. Do you think that's what's the possibility that we might see a similar revolution in for the treatment of conditions such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease?
So the lesson from immuno-oncology for a Neanderthal like me is that all of those successes came out of decades of basic science research, which was not sexy. The work of people like Jim Allison, Drew Padal, and others required substantial blue sky thinking and support, and took decades of fundamental research to come to fruition. Immuno-oncology didn't drop out of the sky. It required a lot of hard grind to get it to where it was. It required thoughtful investment at the venture and biotech level for companies like Medarex that ended up being subsumed into BMS, and obviously Merck with their franchise, who had the roots of discovery for their molecule in the UK, of course, and MRCT, I guess, as it was, and LifeArc as it is now. So my sense is that with the quickening of the pace of fundamental research, and we mustn't allow that to be stalled, we must support it through the taxpayer and otherwise. Those discoveries will come through. And as I've said already, I think supporting the venture community, particularly early, but also later, to support clinical assets, will mean that we will see, I think, mushrooming of opportunities like immuno-oncology, but in areas like neurodegeneration, autoinflammatory disease, orphan diseases, we'll see novel therapeutic modalities addressing targets in the most amazing ways. So I'm supremely optimistic that with the right ecosystem, we will achieve that everywhere. We should take our inspiration, as we all have, from immuno-oncology. Great.
Houman, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to me today. Those insights and in fact, those recommendations, I'm sure, are going to resonate with many in our audience. So if you'd like to tune into future conversations in healthcare, follow our LinkedIn page, where we will be posting alerts to future episode releases. So in closing, I'd like to thank Houman again for joining us, and thank all our listeners for tuning in. So until next time, stay safe and healthy. I'm Mike Ward, and I'll see you in the next episode.